You know, I've been wrestling in my mind to try to understand what is going on with Hamas. Why would they commit suicide? Why would they start this war against Israel? It made no sense. There was an article today written by the former Attorney General Michael Mukasey, who maybe had some clarification on that, saying that Hamas had basically double-crossed their patrons in Syria and had turned to Egypt and turned to the Sunnis as opposed to the Shias. And they now don't have any supporters, and they're looking for some capture of Israeli soldiers or some thing on the military front that would give them credibility. And that makes some major sense. And what now Israel has found is that there's a huge network of tunnels that would enable them to slip into Israel and capture soldiers. One raiding party, they had tranquilizers and handcuffs, and they thought if they can get a soldier, then they can use him for leverage and show their buddies around the Arab world, look what we're doing something. Terry?
Well, now Israel is sending troops into Gaza to try to destroy those tunnels. Chris Mitchell brings us the story.
The IDF released this chilling footage of the Hamas terrorists who infiltrated Israel. Israeli soldiers stopped the infiltration, but it's this kind of Hamas operation that presents a clear and present danger to Israelis along the border with Gaza. The tunnels are designed to infiltrate Israeli communities like this one close to the border. Gaza is just about a mile that direction, and some of these tunnels are more than a mile long, 60 feet deep with multiple exits. It proves that Hamas has been planning this for a very long time.
And I can't imagine anything more terrifying for the people who live there than the thought that suddenly the earth opens up, almost like a scene out of a grade B zombie movie. And the walking dead come out, except they're not dead, they're not walking, and they're armed with machine guns, anti-tank missiles, grenades, and a few thousand rounds of ammunition. That's why we had to do the ground operation. There was absolutely no choice. What country in the world would allow its people to be under that kind of danger?
The first goal of Israel's ground campaign is to discover and destroy this elaborate maze of tunnels. This is footage of IDF soldiers discovering a tunnel inside a home and destroying the tunnel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told Israelis to expect an extended campaign to eliminate Hamas rocket fire from Gaza and these tunnels. In one attack against Hamas, more than 100 Palestinians, both civilians and terrorists, died in Sajia, a Hamas stronghold. For 3 days, Israel warned residents by phone calls and leaflets to get out of harm's way, while the Hamas interior minister told civilians to stay.
Hamas is effectively conducting self-genocide. They're placing their women and children around missile launchers, shooting missiles and rockets at Israel, waiting for us to retaliate in order for them to kill their own women and children, and that's what's happening.
Former U.S. President Bill Clinton said using civilians is part of Hamas's strategy.
They have a strategy designed to force Israel to kill their own civilians so that the rest of the world will condemn them.
While diplomatic efforts continue to try to arrange a ceasefire, Israel called up more troops in its effort to eliminate the threat posed by Hamas to the Jewish state. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, on the Israeli-Gaza border.
Thanks, Chris. Well, once they're in there, they've got to finish. They cannot just do this halfway. They've got to get through the tunnels and all those missile launching sites and destroy the rocketry that Hamas has in its hands. They can't keep having this type of incursion. They can't do it. And so the world scene, the world opinion can riot and wring their hands all they want to, but Israel has a right to defend itself. And once again, you can understand why Bill Clinton is popular. He said it right. Well, doctors and hospitals along the Israeli border are treating patients under the constant threat of attacks. John Jessup has that story from Washington. Here's John.
Pat, CBN's George Thomas got exclusive access to a hospital that's on the front lines of the battle, a hospital that treats both Israeli and Palestinian patients. Here's George's report from Ashkelon, Israel.
Dr. Ron Lobel has worked at Barzilai Hospital for 34 years. But as deputy director of the hospital, he still cannot get used to the sound of the siren, warning of incoming rockets, which sends everyone scrambling to shelter.
We've been living with this situation of rockets exploding above the hospital, and some of them were exploding within the premises of the hospital.
Barzilai is just 7 miles from Gaza and within easy reach of Hamas's rockets.
It means that our staff driving back and forth, coming for their shifts, are under threat.
Barzilai is also one of the main hospitals treating injured Israeli soldiers coming off the battlefield. CBN News was there when medics brought in a soldier severely injured during a firefight with Hamas. Under normal conditions, when I mean normal, when the war is not going on, this room would be sealed off. There would be no use of it. But today, it's a hive of activity because it houses some of the most vulnerable patients here in the city. Dr. Lobel gave CBN News a tour of the hospital, including the underground bunker turned neonatal ward that's caring for premature babies.
This is the most sheltered area in the hospital, the real sheltered area in the hospital. And these are the babies that might suffer most from moving urgently from one place to another.
Barzilai also treats Palestinian patients from the West Bank. In fact, before the recent conflict erupted, patients from Gaza routinely visited the hospital. But Hamas has stopped that for now. Lobel has spent many years in Gaza training Palestinian doctors and nurses. Many of them have worked at Barzilai alongside their Israeli counterparts.
You can see lying side by side a patient from Gaza and a patient from Sderot or from Ashkelon being injured by a Palestinian rocket. And they lie side by side, and they are being treated by Israeli doctors and by Palestinian trainees. We always say that we have a box at the entrance where we leave our politics outside, and here whoever knocks on our door is being treated.
Lobel says the hospital is a symbol of what he hopes will someday bring lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. George Thomas, CBN News, Ashkelon, Israel.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is lashing out against criticism in the wake of the downing of a Malaysia Airlines flight over eastern Ukraine. New evidence puts the blame on Russian-backed separatists in Ukraine. Those rebels are also blocking recovery efforts and confiscating crucial evidence, including the plane's black boxes. Dale Hurd has the story.
4 days after the tragedy, the crash site and all the evidence still remain unexamined. Around 250 bodies have been recovered. Most moved to these refrigerated rail cars after lying out in the sun for days. World outrage is growing.
I want to arrange their funeral. I can't. I don't know where they are. I want my children back.
Russian President Vladimir Putin was on the defensive, accusing others of exploiting the crash for so-called mercenary objectives. He's also still blaming Ukraine authorities for reigniting the fighting with pro-Russian rebels. Secretary of State John Kerry was having none of that.
Russia has armed the separatists. Russia has supported the separatists. Russia has trained the separatists. Russia continues to refuse to call publicly for the separatists to engage in behavior that would lend itself to a resolution of this issue.
The U.S. says it tracked a missile from rebel territory hitting the plane. And there are audio intercepts released by the Ukraine government showing rebel leaders discussing the shootdown. The U.S. also saw a Russian convoy carrying military equipment entering Ukraine last week, and 3 anti-aircraft missile systems brought in before the shootdown were then quickly rushed back across the border into Russia after the incident. The Ukrainian Prime Minister calls it a crime against humanity. Meanwhile, President Obama is being criticized for not being forceful enough.
President Obama is trying to be deliberative. It comes off as indecisive. He's trying to be thoughtful. It comes off as weakness. The Europeans are never going to lead on this issue. It is indispensable that America lead.
Dale Hurd, CBN News.
Pat, what do you think is the best move for the United States to take now?
Well, John, the thing that's very important is some years ago, before communism fell, the Lord had spoken to me. I hear infrequently, but I did hear that communism was going to fall in the Soviet Union. And I said that, and everybody kind of gasped in horror. How could you say such a foolish thing? Well, it did fall. And we had glasnost and perestroika. But the other thing the Lord said after that Russia is going to be the most dangerous. And at this point of time, we have a KGB operative. He's been called a thug, but he certainly is a trained operative who wants to recreate a greater Russia. And he wants all the territories that Russia used to have, and he wants to build it up. And at the same time, he is in possession, and that's what's so important to realize. He's in the possession of an incredible nuclear arsenal. They have, right now, as I am speaking, they have intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads that are aimed at the United States of America. And all he'd have to do is push a button and he would incinerate Washington and New York and who knows what other targets. Yes, we could blow them off the map too, but at the same time, it'll be a hideous mess. And that we've got to be very careful when we deal with these people. I mean, we push him into the corner, and like a cornered rat, he'll start lashing out. But he's got to be stopped, and he has to be restrained. But how do we do it? I think sanctions will work. I think the idea of us producing more oil and more gas so that the Gazprom and the Russians don't have a monopoly on the gas for Europe. There could be some things like this, but we've got to be very, very careful in dealing with somebody who has a nuclear arsenal of that magnitude. I just warn everybody. I mean, we've got to be tough, but at the same time, he's got to know that we're engaged and we want to be fair in this. If he thinks we're going off course and doing some screwy thing, he's liable to do it in kind. But we've got a KGB man who's been trained in terror. John?
Pat, Americans have a favorable view of Jews, Catholics, and evangelical Christians, but they look less favorably at atheists and Muslims. That's according to a survey by Pew Research reported in the Wall Street Journal. The poll found that more than 40% of Americans rated Jews, Catholics, and evangelicals the highest. Buddhists, Hindus, and Mormons were in the middle third, with atheists and Muslims having the lowest favorable ratings. A Christian woman who escaped imprisonment and death in Sudan now faces another obstacle, a new lawsuit. Members of Miriam Ibrahim's family are suing to have her marriage annulled in an attempt to keep her in the country. She and her family are stuck in the U.S. Embassy in Khartoum. She'd been sentenced to death for marrying a Christian and abandoning the Muslim faith. A judge dropped the sentence after an international outcry, but she hasn't yet been able to get out of the country. Jihadists from the Islamic State in Iraq have forced Christians in Mosul to flee the city. The militants told Christians they can convert to Islam, pay a protection tax, or face death. Most Christians fled to the nearby Kurdish region or other areas protected by Kurdish security forces. Residents in Mosul say militants are occupying churches and seizing the homes of Christians who've already fled. Mosul's Christian community goes back nearly 2,000 years. Before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, some 100,000 Christians lived there. Today, it's believed there are fewer than 200, and Pat, some reports suggest there may be none at all.
Again, the folly of us going in after Saddam Hussein. It was an ill-considered war based on faulty premises. I'm sorry. I mean, whatever your feeling is, it wasn't smart. And we're still reaping the consequences. But nevertheless, we should have had a status of forces agreement. We didn't do it. We walked out in a hurry. It was a PR campaign to get us out. And as a result, this ISIS has moved in. And the military, they had almost 1 million men under arms, armed with very sophisticated weapons. A few terrorists driving pickup trucks and a few machine guns routed completely the Israeli army. Why? Because their generals were corrupt, and Mohammed not Morsi, but the Maliki, the prime minister, had tried to humiliate the Sunnis. And it was a terrible thing. He ruined the armed forces, and we left him in power, and that's the result. But this seems like to me what we really need is to recognize Kurdistan as an independent country, give those Kurds some help, and let them do what they do best. And they can pacify that region and give stability to the people and freedom to the Christians.
President Obama is signing executive orders today creating specific protections for gay and transgender employees in the federal government and federal contractors. The move forbids discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but there is an exemption for religious contractors. It allows them to hire only fellow believers. That exemption was created by President George Bush, but it's unclear whether that exemption will apply to sexual orientation. CBN is working with Jesus.net, an international web-based ministry, to spread the gospel in India. It has partnered with a local website with both English and Hindi versions. It shares about the love of Jesus and provides a prayer of salvation for people who want to accept Christ. In the last 2 months, more than 22,000 people have accessed both versions of the website, and 80% have come through a mobile device. So far, more than 1,900 people have accepted Christ through this Internet Evangelism Network. Well, if you'd like to find out more about what CBN is doing around the world, you can do so by logging on to cbn.com/international.